The US did very well out of the commercial relationship with China. Huge profits, again, at companies like Apple, like Tesla, etc. What does the US get out of the adversarial relationship? Why would they want it? How does it work? And I don't think this has been properly laid out for either US policymakers or US voters. I'm so glad you started with 2018 because I do think this is a breaking point. And yes, I think that China was completely blindsided when the US banned semiconductors. To be honest, they just weren't expecting it. It was a shot across the bow. And yeah, to your point, I think the leadership in China panicked a little bit. They did think if they're banning us from semiconductors today, tomorrow it could be chemical products, it could be auto parts, it could be anything. And so they decided to, essentially, they told the banks, guys, normal loans to real estate, all the money has to go to industry, all the money has to go into developing our own tech system. They also got all the big tech guys in a room and said, guys, the US has declared economic war on us. I know you've been making lots of money, optimizing puppy videos on the internet, and this was great, well done you. But from now on, you guys have to develop semiconductors. You have to develop your own servers, your own software. And, this is when you had the whole Jack Ma incident. And suddenly Jack Ma goes on a stage in Shanghai and says, the government's trying to tell me how to run my business, but they have no clue. So the government says, I don't think you heard us correctly. Maybe we didn't make ourselves clear. Let's have this discussion again. And so there was a mobilization of all resources towards that goal for the past 7 years. And during these 7 years, I think the Western world looked at China and very much, saw the consequent real estate bust. If in the US, the government said no more loans to real estate wouldn't be so hot. So you have a massive real estate bust. And when you picked up your copy of the FT, the Wall Street Journal, whatever else, all you got was the real estate bust for 7 years. And I think we were kind of blind to how quickly China was moving up the value chain on the back of this wave of capital. And by the way, not just money, not just physical capital, also human capital. Because essentially the tech companies were told, stop hiring the best engineers out of Tsinghua and Fudan, the best universities in China, to build video games. From now on, you're going to develop semiconductors. Now, China produces more STEM graduates every year than the whole rest of the world combined if you exclude India. It's China in 25 years has gone from 350,000 university students a year to 12 million university students a year. So it's an improvement in human capital. And this human capital is essentially being driven for the past 7 years towards you have to develop our own tech solutions. We have to develop our own industrial solution. We have to completely de-Westernize our supply chains. And now all of a sudden we wake up to a world in which China's producing the best cars, not just the cheapest cars, but also the best cars. Here's a mind-blowing fact. Like you take Audi in China has now, which was the very first Western brand in China. It was synonymous of luxury for the longest time. They've dropped their four-circle branding and the Audi name to adopt a Chinese branding because if you're in China now, European cars are perceived as inferior to Chinese cars. Just to put things in perspective. Another example, I'm sure you've seen the interview of the Ford CEO where he highlights that he went to China, was blown away by what he saw, and bought a Xiaomi and brought it back to the US. And he drives a Xiaomi to work every day. I mean, this is like the Coca-Cola CEO saying he'd rather drink Pepsi. It's kind of mind-blowing to me. So I think, to be honest, China has leapfrogged the West in industry after industry. Take turbines, take telecom switches, take everything except the very high end of semiconductors. China's by now leapfrogged the West. And we missed it because for 3 years, nobody visited China because of COVID. And then once COVID reopened, post-COVID, Russia had invaded Ukraine. Everybody was running around telling you China was uninvestable because they were going to invade Taiwan, because they were part of the axis of evil with Russia, et cetera, et cetera. So everybody missed that you had this huge step up in China's industrial capacity. And so now today, China's bidding in Saudi Arabia to build nuclear power plants at half the cost of the French. Being French, I look at this, I'm like, I always thought we'd own the nuclear space. I always thought, we got lots of problems in France, but at least we got that. We don't even have that anymore. So it's, this for me, this one of the single most important macro development is how quickly China's moved up the value chain in terms of industry. And yes, it is knocking on the door of tech. And I'm sorry to be long-winded, but yesterday, the FT had an article saying, okay, Xi Jinping is now banning NVIDIA chips in China. I look at this and I think, okay, either that's hubris on the Chinese part. They think they're advanced enough that they actually don't need NVIDIA. Option one. And there was some inclination of that with DeepSeek, right? It's like, oh, we can produce DeepSeek without the high-end NVIDIA chips. Or they think that, Chinese chips, the Huawei, the SMIC, et cetera, are like close enough that all they need is a little more impetus and they'll get there. Or alternatively, Xi Jinping is trying to trip up the US market. Because if you trip up NVIDIA, NVIDIA in 2.5 years has gone from a 300 billion market cap to a 4.3 trillion market cap. 4 trillion of wealth creation in one company in less than 2.5 years. Unprecedented in the history of capitalism. I'm not American, I'm not Chinese, I'm French. The question is, what relationship does the US want to have with China? Is it a commercial relationship or is it an adversarial relationship? And it's not for me to answer. It's for you as voters. It's for US policymakers to answer this. And I think the US really hasn't decided what it wants to do. I think up until 2018, essentially the US was saying, we definitely want a commercial relationship with China. We want to make as much money as possible. And so Apple puts its plants there and Tesla puts its plants there. And Tesla provides the impetus for the EV industry to grow massively in China, et cetera. So up until 2018, the relationship was very clear. This is a commercial relationship. Everybody's trying to make as much money as possible. This is capitalism. Everybody's happy. Everybody works in the same direction. 2018, the relationship shifts. We're no longer commercial. We're now adversarial. And that was reinforced in 21 when Blinken and Sullivan met with their counterparts in Anchorage. Blinken came out of there saying the relationship will be commercial where it needs to be and adversarial where it needs to be, which, if you're China, you're like, well, where does that leave me? It's like, so, where is that line between adversarial and commercial? Can you be both at the same time? When the US had an adversarial relationship with the Soviet Union, it was understood that it was two separate worlds. There was very, very little commercial transactions. Today, if the US really wants to have an adversarial relationship with China, this has massive, massive implications for the US stock markets. What's the value of Apple without China? What's the value of Tesla without China? What's the value of Walmart? What's the value of ExxonMobil that does a ton of business in China? All this in a way that just wasn't happening with the Soviet Union. So is an adversarial relationship with China in the US's long-term interest, to the extent that China is now essentially the biggest trade partner for almost every major market except for Mexico and Canada. If you turn around, if you're the US now and you tell a Brazil or you tell a Chile, perhaps even a Germany or a Turkey, hey, look, it's us or them, they might pick them. This isn't the Cold War all over again. So can the US even afford to have an adversarial relationship with China? And more importantly, what does the US get out of it? Like, what's the end goal? To have an adversarial relationship with China. The US did very well out of the commercial relationship with China. It's, huge profits, again, at companies like Apple, like Tesla, et cetera. What does the US get out of the adversarial relationship? Why would they want it? How does it work? And I don't think this has been properly laid out for either US policymakers or US voters. But again, it's not for me to decide. What I do note is that right now, you essentially have your bum in between two chairs, where sometimes you want to be commercial, sometimes you want to be adversarial, and I think you get the worst of both worlds.
偷偷告诉大家，我最近发现了新法宝 Royal Face 逆时奇迹系列，它有活肤露、全效精华，还有精华霜。尤其我皮肤比较偏干，所以我非常的注重保湿。保湿做得好，肌肤自然烹饪。提亮肤色更年轻，抚平皱纹超有感，而且气色变好。用心保养，每天都更美一点。美吧。